everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hello. If you are returning, welcome back. Thank you so much for sticking around. I really appreciate you. So today's video is going to be on what seems to be like a little bit more of a niche conversation, or at least it is in like my corner of the internet within the fat activism community. But that's the conversation surrounding the new Netflix show Baby Reindeer. And I actually saw Michelle McDaniel posted a video on Baby Reindeer also like a couple days ago. I haven't watched it because I purposefully like don't watch videos on things that I'm planning on making videos of, but I'm sure it's great, so go check that out as well. I think the whole discourse surrounding this show is really interesting as it pertains to like fat people in TV and movies, and like casting of fat characters, and just the portrayal of fat people in media as a whole, which is something that I've wanted to talk about on here for a really long time. And this is only going to be kind of like an introduction to that topic. I personally have watched Baby Reindeer and in its entirety, and I loved it. But of course, there is a fat main character who is more or less the antagonist in the show. And of course, fat activism TikTok creators, at least a few of them, have things to say about it. And since they have things to say about it and I have thoughts and opinions on what they're talking about, here I am. I have entered the chat as well. Anyway. That's what we're going to be talking about today, so let's just get into it. But before we get into today's video, I want to thank today's video sponsor, Aura. Now, data brokers sell your information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, relatives information, all of it is out there. And that's why I've been using Aura, who is the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my information not only helps me keep all of the annoying spam emails and spam calls at bay, but it also protects me from hackers who could use my information to access things like my social accounts, my bank accounts, and other sensitive information. One thing I love about Aura compared to other services is it actually offers other features. It has things like a VPN, an antivirus, password management, identity theft protection. It also has parental controls, but I'm not a parent, so I don't need those. But I actually used it to scan all of the files on my computer, which I am a big Sims 4 girly, and I cannot play it without the mods like many other people cannot. Mods for The Sims are downloaded like kind of anywhere. And so you can imagine the comfort that I felt when Aura told me that nothing was harming my computer that I had downloaded for The Sims. Aura is always on and is always keeping me safe, so I can more easily focus on like the 5 million other things I have to do while I'm at my computer. I value your privacy just as much as I value my own, and so if you'd like to give Aura a whirl, be sure to use the link down in my description box, which is aura.com/MeganAnne. That's aura.com/MEGANANNE to start your 2-week free trial. And like I said, that will also be linked down below in my description. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back into the video. Figured we should start off with just like a brief synopsis of what Baby Reindeer is and what it's about and all of that. And without going full like art school media analysis at you like I did with The Whale, which I'm still really proud of that video, and if you haven't seen it, please go watch it if you feel like it, because I'm very proud of that video. But Baby Reindeer is a show that was recently released on Netflix, and it's a UK show. It stars comedian and actor Richard Gadd, and it tells Richard Gadd's real life story about being stalked by a woman named Martha. And it talks about his navigation through that experience, also how a previous trauma that he experienced like influenced how he navigated that whole thing. And I watched the entire thing just completely on a whim one night, and I stayed up until 3 a.m. watching it because the way in which the story is told and the acting in it are phenomenal. I guess like kind of spoiler alert, but it's pretty out there now, but the trauma that Richard experienced that he has to like work through in order to work through what he's going on, or what he's going through with Martha, is SA, and which also heavy trigger warning, especially for episode 4, which there's a trigger warning on the episode itself, but like that's a very big theme throughout this whole show, so just so that's out there. The show does a phenomenal job at exploring how like one traumatic event, like especially in regards to SA, can like trickle down into how you navigate the rest of your life from then on in regards to things like relationships, or in Richard's case, even more trauma. I also really appreciated how it shows that like SA survivors can have pretty complicated relationships with the people who SA'd them, as a survivor myself. And I think it's also great because Richard Gadd is like brutally honest throughout the whole thing, in particular with his thoughts and feelings surrounding Martha, the woman who stalks him, as well as his roles in like his main relationship throughout the show with a trans woman named Terry. He makes it like very clear throughout the show that he is not like the quote unquote perfect victim, and I think that's like such an important thing to talk about because there is no such thing as a perfect victim. And honestly, I think the show is like a great commentary on trauma and how it impacts us on its own. But when you factor in the fact that this is Richard Gadd's like personal story and that this did happen to him, it makes it all the more captivating, especially when you realize that he is the person playing himself in the show. Like, it's a great show. Highly recommend if you're in the market for that kind of thing. But yeah, well, honestly, it's about a lot of other things. Like, on the surface, it is about a man, Richard, being stalked by a woman named Martha. And this did happen in real life. And in the show, Martha is portrayed as an overweight, like middle-aged, I think, woman who Richard meets while at his bartending job, and she's sat at the bar crying and she doesn't have any money to like buy anything, and so he offers her a cup of tea for free. And after he offers her that cup of tea, so begins the infatuation because she has a history with stalking in the past also. The show goes on to depict the intense stalking of Richard by Martha, and everyone in Richard's life also by Martha. And Richard has said that this totaled about 41,000 emails, 350 hours of voicemails, and 106 pages of letters. And Martha in the show is like brilliantly portrayed by the actress Jessica Gunning. And I would say brilliant regardless, but as we'll see later, it is spot on. So as soon as I saw Martha on the screen, like literally immediately I thought to myself, oh god, fat activism TikTok is going to have an issue with this. And honestly, it's not as big of a conversation as I thought it would be, but the conversation is happening regardless, and they are bringing in topics that could otherwise be like very valid things to talk about, but as usual, they're kind of twisting them and making it a whole other.
Talk to me about the potential impact of baby reindeer on the fat community. Hi, I'm Dashita, and this is day one of me asking TikTok all the pop culture questions that I have. While much has already been said about baby reindeer, I want to talk about Jessica Gunning's casting as Martha. Now, Richard Gadd has said that the original stalker and the Netflix character look nothing alike to protect the identity of the stalker. This makes me question, why did the creators decide to cast a fat woman as Martha? To caveat, Jessica Gunning is absolutely brilliant in the show. She gave me the creeps. I could not sleep at night. I could not talk to my friends in the same way. But I also paused to wonder, does this play into the bias and prejudice that people have against the fat community? Think of the fat and obsessive trope, this idea that bigger sized people, irrespective of their gender, are so bereft of any kind of attention and desire that even a sliver of it makes them hold on to it with every fiber of their being, leading to this kind of stalkerish, obsessive behavior. I also want to call myself out and say, is it fair to question Jessica Gunning's casting in this role when she has a successful repertoire of work behind her only because of how she looks? But as a plus-size woman, when I switched on the show, this observation leapt at me instantly, making me a bit wary if more people are going to buy into the fat and obsessive theory because of the casting in this show, especially if they haven't watched Richard's original video where he says that the stalker looks nothing like Martha in the Netflix show. Am I deeping it? Is this something that stood out to you as well? Make it make sense with me.
Before we get into the progression of the conversations on TikTok surrounding this show, I just want to say that, like, in the middle of all of this, I don't know where it falls in the timeline, the internet did find out who Martha actually is, because her real name is not Martha, or who Martha is believed to be. It hasn't been confirmed by anybody, but they have found out who Martha is believed to be. And she has also since been interviewed by Piers Morgan. So, yeah. Naturally, Martha's size was like the first thing that was brought up by fat activists and just other people on the internet too. One person who brought it up, she's actually a pretty popular like fat activist, fat liberation content creator on TikTok, and I believe she has a podcast that is kind of like centered around like the portrayal of fat people in media. It's called Not Just Another Tracy Turnblad, I believe. I've seen this creator talk about The Whale and other things before, and usually they're like not correct in my opinion. But I will say their take on this show is actually pretty nuanced, so here's that.
Let's talk about Baby Reindeer and the fat stalker trope. A bazillion people told me to watch this, and now I have some thoughts. For those who don't know, this is a series that's absolutely blowing up on Netflix right now. Everybody's talking about it, and what's really fascinating about the series is it is based on this man who plays the lead's real-life experience being stalked by this woman who in the series is called Martha. Martha is played by the absolutely phenomenal actress Jessica Gunning, pictured here, and yes, she's fat. Now, going into Baby Reindeer, I had really low expectations. I thought I was gonna hate it, to be honest, because this trope of the fat woman as like creepy, obsessed stalker is so common in media, and I had heard people talking about how they purposely chose an actress in a larger body so that her body would communicate the creepiness better. And yeah, that stalker character of Martha, she's absolutely terrifying. She's incredibly creepy. She's incredibly sexually forward. It's very, very deeply uncomfortable to watch, especially as a fat person, when I feel like every time I see a fat character on screen in a major role, I'm like, this is about me. And being seen as this type of creepy stalker is my literal worst fear. Now, usually when we see this trope of the sexually aggressive fat woman, it's in comedy. And it's a joke how sexually forward she is because who would ever be interested in her, right? And how could she think anyone would ever be interested in her? But here, that same quality is taken as evidence of her mental illness, and she's actually portrayed as menacing and dangerous. And it can feel a little bit jarring to watch because of that, and it can feel almost more overtly negative or fatphobic even because of that. But it's also a really good thing to be taking this kind of behavior seriously as assault instead of laughing it off because how could that ever happen? For the first like 2 episodes or so of Baby Reindeer, I was feeling like, oh, they are using her body as shorthand for creepy and desperate and disgusting. That is why they cast this actress. And that was because in the first few episodes, we see the guy entertaining her a lot more and not being overtly turned off by her behavior. So it almost feels like we as the audience are supposed to assume that obviously she's creepy because what fat woman would do this without thinking of how it would come off. But as the stalking intensifies, it gets less and less like her body is shorthand for being creepy and the focus is more on her behavior. But when I finished the show, I looked up and I found out that the woman who claims Martha is based on her looks kind of similar to the actress, and based on her like hair and makeup, they've clearly based the costume choices and the makeup choices and the aesthetic choices with the actress off of this real woman. So actually in multiple ways in the show, because spoiler, there's a whole exploration of sexual assault changing somebody's sexual orientation, there are multiple things in the show where it's like it is a problematic and harmful trope usually, but because it is this person's lived experience, it feels absolutely okay to dramatize that, and I don't think they should have to change it just so it doesn't further a problematic trope. But at the same time, because the show is so popular and because it does contain those tropes, it might disseminate them and convince people of them, especially because it's based on real life. But at the end of the day, that wouldn't be such an issue if there wasn't so little media about fat people and centering fat people that didn't revolve around these storylines of being sexually aggressive or creepy. Because the more variety we see in characterizations of a certain group, the less likely we are to extrapolate that portrayal, because we see so few, is indicative of the entire group in real life. So yes, the show made me say I'm never having sex again because I don't want to come off like her. But also, this show was really well done and really good, and I don't think this, by the way, phenomenal actress was cast just because her body communicated some kind of creepiness or desperation. I think that if the real life Martha had been skinny, they probably would have cast a skinny actress, to be honest. And it's okay that this is how it happened, but it doesn't mean this is what fat people are. And I wish we had enough media that people would just know that. I am going to do a podcast episode on it later that will be much more in depth. So if you have anything you want me to address or cover there, drop it in the comments.
And then I went and looked at the comments on the TikTok as well, and naturally some people were missing the point that even this creator was making. Someone says like, I saw her in this show and immediately thought, of course the villain is fat. Someone else said, at first I was afraid that he chose a fat actress so people could portray her as a villain easier, knowing that fat people are hated, but she's actually chubby IRL. And then this creator responded and said, yeah, that makes it better intent-wise, but unfortunately not everyone will know what the real person looks like. Somebody in the comments actually brought up the movie Duff also, and how I think in the book it's based off of, the protagonist is described as like fat or plus size. In the movie, she was not cast as a fat person, which I think is a very valid point to bring up. And then the creator responded with this.
I think this is an excellent point because time and time again we see in a lot of media where there are people who are either based on real life people or based on characters from a previous book or franchise that are canonically plus size or fat, and yet they get changed into thin people for the Hollywood version. And yes, it is a British show, yes, things are a little different in British TV, but this kind of situation where the person is still fat is really telling, because what types of roles are we letting people stay fat to play? In The Duff, she's the protagonist, she gets the guy, you're supposed to be rooting for her the whole time, and so they cast somebody who wasn't plus size. And I'm not saying this is why, and I don't mean this to diminish Mae Whitman at all, who I'm actually a huge fan of. I just think it's really interesting how time and time again, when a character is plus size, another example that I think about all the time is Musical Parade. Lucille was plus size in real life, and there's a mention of her being fat in the script, and never has been cast as a plus size actress professionally. Because this is a character you're supposed to sympathize with. She's a protagonist, she's lovable, she's a wife. Like, I really think that we use fatness as shorthand for undesirable in so much media. And so the choice to even keep a character fat who's based on somebody who does look similar, I don't know how fat she was at the time that these events transpired, like I don't know the details, but like from the photos I've seen of her in the press, she does seem to be like pretty similar looking to the actor. But even so, I think it's really indicative of our cultural stereotypes about fat people and what we believe fatness telegraphs about a person's character and a person's, life experiences and personality, which you see the character of Johnny making those assumptions in Baby Reindeer when he's like, oh, she probably was never asked to a school dance, etc. Like, we assume fat people means romantically unsuccessful, undesirable, lonely, etc. And when the character, even if the character is canonically fat, and that is part of their arc, which in both of the examples, The Duff and Parade, it kind of is, and it would be very sellable with a fat person, even so, because the ending is happy, they don't get fat actors, or it's not important for it to be a fat actor. And I don't know how much size went into the casting decisions here. I hope not at all, but it definitely says something that where Hollywood is willing to place a fat person is in this kind of role.
And then further down my journey through the rabbit hole on this whole TikTok conversation surrounding Baby Reindeer, I found this video.
Already dreading the comment section of this video. But I want to talk about this show, Baby Reindeer. And this show is captivating. It is such an interesting look at trauma in a way that most media shies away from, in the way that it doesn't make sense. The choices you make after just aren't logical. They're very often self-destructive and destructive of everyone else around you. But the main reason I want to talk about this show is because of the choices in casting. And now everybody who was cast in this show did a phenomenal job. Everyone was so authentic and believable, and it was like actually harrowing to be in these characters' shoes for parts of this show. My issue is with the casting of Martha. And not because Jessica Gunn, I think her name is, didn't do a phenomenal job. She probably was the most visceral performance of this entire show. But my issue is in the casting of her, certain stereotypes are being perpetuated. Because Jessica Gunn is fat. And this perpetuates this trend that we saw a lot in the 90s and early 2000s of having a fat, particularly fat woman, particularly an older fat woman, being sexually interested in you, being seen as dangerous. This character, not because of anything to do with her physical description, size, or anything, is an absolute threat to the main character and everyone else in his life. But that is not to do with the fact that she's fat, and yet I fear that it might be taken that way. Watching the show made me viscerally uncomfortable because of the implications of having someone who is viewed by society in a certain way in this role. When we think about the kind of people who commit certain crimes, a certain image is brought to our minds, usually someone who is fatter, someone who is conventionally unattractive. And I think that this show does a disservice by feeding into that stereotype in a certain way with the casting choices. Also because these crimes are not committed by a certain kind of person. These crimes are committed by anyone. And having these roles reserved for people who do or can be made to look a certain way does harm not only to the people who naturally look that kind of way anyway in society, but also to people who could potentially be victims of this kind of thing. Because with this perpetuating of certain looking people, or like certain looks of people perpetuating these crimes, it can create a false sense of security when interacting with someone who falls outside of these norms. My issue is within the choices that were made within the story and the implications that casting choices had on the story. So certain things could be quite lazily done by casting the beautiful Jessica Gunner as Martha, that otherwise the writing would have had to fight for more if they had cast someone conventionally attractive. Had this character been portrayed by someone genuinely conventionally attractive, made to look in the show conventionally attractive, the writing would have had to do more to convey the things that are conveyed. And I also think it would have had a very different and very interesting spin on the show. Like, how many fat girls specifically have been made fun of for liking someone? How many recipients of their like have been made fun of, and the punch of the joke literally just being, this person who is fat likes you? How many times has it been used as a threat that someone who is fat, specifically fat women, be sexually into you? And I hate that a show doing so much for bringing to light trauma, specifically as a result of sexual abuse, have this kind of view and this kind of impact. I don't know. My thoughts are a bit all over the place, and I don't really know how to word it better than I have, but basically that is what I have been struggling with since literally just finishing this show.
And then I went to the comments and saw people were saying things like, people shouldn't have to change their traumatic life stories because media sucks at representation. Advocate more for fat characters outside of the stereotypes, or use different characters. The show, I don't know. The comment cut off, but you kind of get the idea of what the person's saying. And someone says, she literally looks almost exactly like the stalker he had. And this creator went back and replied to those comments saying things like, Martha being fat has no impact on the story unless you are fat phobic. This is a piece of media. It has an impact. I can point that out. And then they also said, even so, he chose to perpetuate a damaging stereotype with the casting, something he could have chosen not to do. So that is like the conversation that's being had around Baby Reindeer as a whole, with fat activism so far. Some of these are from like the end of April or like a week ago, and I will get into my thoughts on this conversation a little bit later. But spoiler alert, I don't think this conversation should be had using Baby Reindeer as an example. Because I want to talk about first, even though like this whole conversation surrounding Baby Reindeer seems short-lived on TikTok, I think it has brought up like a very important conversation that still very much needs to be had today, and that is the portrayal of fat people, and specifically fat women, in media. And I'm planning on doing a much more objective and like in-depth like history lesson video on the portrayal of fat people as a whole in media, but I just wanted to talk about it as it pertains to this show and this conversation that's being had about this show and the casting of Martha right now. Because one thing I did not know when it came to all of this is that I didn't know that Richard Gadd had stated that the casting of Martha was not based on her appearance, and so like, or her real life appearance. So like, I can understand where the criticism of casting a fat woman in this role came from with only that context. Like, before anybody found out who she is, like, I could totally understand where the criticism came from with that. Because I've had this conversation with a lot of people like in my real life. It always kind of shocks me like how many people like who just like didn't grow up fat are like unaware of this issue, which like if this wasn't applicable to you growing up, like I totally understand why you wouldn't be aware of it. But it just always shocks me because it was just such a big part of my life growing up, at least in my lifetime, and like also before it, because I have consumed a lot of media that was made and put out before I was even a thought in my parents' heads. Time and time again, fat people, and especially fat women, are portrayed to be like the butt of the joke, extremely undesirable, the trusty like best friend side character who gets to watch her conventionally attractive thin best friend get the guy and live happily ever after while she just like sits on the sidelines and cheers her on, and or always focused on like her weight and wanting to change it. Or like even in shows like Law and Order or like Criminal Minds, which those kinds of shows, like crime procedural shows, have a lot of issues on their own besides this topic. A lot of times, the only time you see fat women in these shows are often portrayed like Martha, who are like desperate stalkers who are hypersexual, except for Garcia in Criminal Minds, and I will always love Criminal Minds for that. But I will say they have had some very problematic villains when it comes to this conversation. And as reality TV became more of a thing, we got shows like the plethora of TV shows on TLC and all the wacky ones that like I get recommended that are from the UK, which honestly to me make fat people out to be kind of like the modern day freak show. I'm going to use This Is Us as an example, which admittedly I have not finished in its entirety because there's so much of it, but I have watched like a considerable amount of it. We have the main character, Kate, whose only plot line really seems to be her size and how much she hates it. While I think she explores very real and valid topics like using food as an emotional coping mechanism, growing up fat and like the ramifications of it in adulthood, it was exhausting that this was really like one of her only plot lines that I saw, at least in the time that I watched it, and it was also exhausting to see yet another fat female main character be boiled down to just her weight and how much she hated herself because of it. And there are like so many examples of this that I can give where female characters ranging of different levels, I guess, of fatness, like are only reduced to their weight and are made the side character or the butt of the joke due to it. But like, it's so hard to narrow it down just for the sake of this video because there are so many of them. And even in movies or musicals, in this case, like Hairspray, which they could never make me hate Hairspray. I fucking love Hairspray. Tracy's weight is still a huge point of conversation throughout the entire movie, and even though she gets the dreamboat Link at the end, she gets him despite her size. I think one of the only examples I can think of where weight is like not a part of a fat female character's plot like at all, like first out, like I mentioned, is Garcia from Criminal Minds, but even then they still talk about it. They still talk about it in earlier episodes when a conventionally handsome man hits on her, who he does wind up shooting her, but she was like, this doesn't happen to girls who look like me. It was still brought up. So like the only time I can really think of where it wasn't brought up and there was just a fat woman just chilling, or like a woman who was bigger than the rest of the other women in the show, just chilling, just vibing, living her life, we're not talking about her size, was Suki from Gilmore Girls, at least to the best of my memory with that one. Even still, like I watched that show for the first time when I was in college. Up until that point, I had only ever really seen this plot line just be so tired and so overused my entire life. I have also heard, I haven't watched it yet, but it's on the list, that Shrill with A.D. Bryant is also very good for this, and that like she does bring her weight up and her experiences as a fat woman up throughout the show, but only when it's like relevant and like it's actually like starting a good conversation. I have shown a clip from Shrill in a previous reaction video because they're having the conversation about weight limits and emergency contraceptive pills, which I think is a super important thing to talk about in mainstream media because I sure as shit did not learn that from my doctor. So like, I think that's a very valid way to bring weight into a conversation and into a fat character's like storyline without like making it feel exhausting, you know? And if it seems like this is something that I can't really talk about objectively when talking about it in like a more casual way like this, it's because I can't. Because like in hindsight, seeing that trope repeated again and again and again, the only time I ever saw a girl in a TV show or a movie that looked like me when I was growing up fucked me up. And looking back at little Megan, like she would always be so excited to finally see a girl who kind of like looked like her in a movie or a TV show that she was watching. But like over time, I got so desensitized to the conversation around those characters always being about how the girl's best friend got the guy and the fat girl just had to watch, or how the girl needed to lose weight and then she became more desirable, or how the fat girl was only there for comedic relief, or how the fat girl became hypersexual, like, and that was why she like was desirable. Like, see Kat from Euphoria, which Euphoria has a lot of other issues, but like Kat from Euphoria, in hindsight and with a lot of therapy, I think that did more damage to my psyche than I realized, because I watched a lot of TV and a lot of movies growing up, and like seeing that be the only way that characters who looked like me were represented, I think just did a lot more damage than I ever realized. And that's why, like, I try to approach the conversations I have on this channel with as much nuance as I can, because fat people are nuanced and they are so much more than just their body size. And I think that's why fat activists and fat liberationists bother me so much, is because as much as they try and say that, their entire platforms are about their body size and about being fat. This is something that is still so oftentimes missed by the media today, is that, like, fat people are more than just what size they are. And no matter what size I am, this is like something I will always stand by, because it caused so much damage up here for me growing up in hindsight. And yeah. So now that I've gotten off my soapbox with that topic, you're probably like, Megan, if that's how you feel, then why do you disagree with the fat activists talking about baby reindeer this way? And that is because, despite Richard Gadd's like pleas to not find out who Martha is in real life, the internet did what the internet did, and they found out who is believed to be IRL Martha. And this is Martha. And as you can probably see, the casting is spot on. And I think this is just me speculating, but I think Richard Gadd like only said that the casting was not based on the actual appearance of Martha, so that people wouldn't go looking for someone who looked like her, and then find her. But like I said, the internet does what the internet does, and they have found pretty much, I think, everybody in real life from the show, including Martha. And like I said, IRL Martha, or at least who we believe to be IRL Martha, because we do not know for sure, has been on Piers Morgan and is now suing Richard Gadd for the show. But this is why I am so angry that this show is being used as a jumping off point for the very real conversation that needs to be had about the portrayal of fat, specifically in this case women, in media. Because even to the most untrained of eyes, it's pretty clear that this is a pretty fucking spot-on casting decision. Just for looks alone, it's so obvious to me that it was not a deliberate thing to cast a fat woman to, like, make her seem more villainous or more creepy or whatever. Like, it's just because they're almost identical. And also, this Martha might not be IRL Martha, but if you watch the show and then you watch her talk on Piers Morgan, I don't know, besties, it's pretty damning. So allegedly, in my opinion, all of those. This makes me go back to the third creator that I featured earlier, where they were saying how even though this is based on Gadd's, like, personal experiences, it still furthers the harmful narratives that are perpetuated by about fat women in media.
You're right. Everyone has the potential to be a bad person, including fat people. And had this series existed in a vacuum, there would be no problem in portraying Martha in this way. The problem is that this show doesn't exist in a vacuum. This show exists in a landscape where we have so much media portraying fat people in a way similar to how Martha is portrayed, and very few showing the other side of it. If we were to extend it to a different analogy, imagine we're some decades back where the only depictions of black people were them as slaves or criminals. Telling the story of O.J. Simpson, while true, still perpetuates the negative stereotype that black people are only slaves or criminals. That is what's happening with fat people at this moment in time. There are no, or very few, portrayals of fat people outside of the roles of comic relief or sex pest in this case. And that is what the harm is. In making this story a dramatization, in almost fictionalizing it to a certain extent, choices were made. They did not cast the real person. They cast an actor, which obviously is the right choice. But in so, they had to make certain concessions and compromises anyway. This is just a different choice they could have made in this casting that might not have had the same societal impact. Also, in this choice of casting, which might be part of the reason why it was chosen, lazy choices can be made. Our preconceived notions of what certain people do or are more prone to do are there. They did not have to work very hard to make you feel uncomfortable around Martha. They did not need to work very hard to make the attraction feel unbalanced and kind of put you on edge, which they would have had to work harder for if a thinner actor had been portrayed. These are the points that I am making. I am making the point that there is no representation on the other side of how fat people can also be loving and well-rounded and stable people, and that it is, to a certain extent, a lazy choice to cast this amazing actress in this role.
And to that I say, bullshit. Just because someone's lived experience might hurt the feelings of some people, especially in this case, fat people, I say as a fat people, does not mean that that person's story like shouldn't be told. Unless obviously it's just outright defamatory or like insulting or could actually harm like a group of people, but you know what I mean. Richard Gadd's story and Baby Reindeer is about so much more than just Martha's appearance. It's barely even brought up in the first couple of episodes, and like it is not brought up past the first couple of episodes, to be honest, as best as I can remember anyways. And this whole thing being brought into how fat people and fat women are portrayed in media reminds me so much of the conversations that we had when The Whale came out and then when it started winning awards and all of that, and how fat activists and fat liberationists made it all about Charlie's size and weight and ED and all of that. But when really like the film was about so much more than that. Like when you looked at it with a critical lens, and again, please go watch that video if you haven't seen it. I'm very proud of it. I went full degree art school media analysis on it. It was great. I'm still really proud of that video, so please go watch it if you haven't. But this whole conversation reminds me of that so much because just like The Whale, Baby Reindeer is about so much more than just Martha's appearance and Martha's weight. And I think this is just another great example of how fat activists and fat liberationists and creators adjacent to those movements can spin certain things to fit their narratives. And that's why I wanted to talk about it. That's all I've got for this one. Please let me know what you think down below about anything that I just talked about. I think this is a really interesting conversation. Like I said, I'm going to be doing a much bigger video on the portrayal of fat people in TVs and movies and media and art and whatever, because I think it's fascinating. Be on the lookout for that whenever that happens, because that's going to be a very large undertaking. But yeah, thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to go to aura.com/MeganAnne. That is aura.com/MEGANANNE for your 2-week free trial. If you want to give it a whirl, it will also be linked down below in my description. As always, thank you to you guys for continuing to watch my videos and just being here in general. I cannot express to you how much I appreciate my audience. It means the world to me. And yeah, that's all I have to say for this one. Remember to be kind to yourself, be kind to others, drink your water, take your meds if you need them, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye.